Well, hello, and thank you for joining me. Today, I've got a very special guest to talk about a very big problem in society of not moving enough and how that connects to the sicknesses we see not only in ourselves as we grow old, but also in our children, which I think is a really important topic. Katy Bowman from Nutritious Movement, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk with you specifically.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, look, this topic, I was really enjoyed your new book, Grow Wild, and we're going to dive into the specifics of that. But your work has really been based for a long time around teaching people how to move and how to get their bodies functioning better, which is something that I really feel that is a big missing factor in our healthcare consideration, and also our system, where we don't think about how structures move and function together. And so you're a biomechanist by training. Can you take us a little bit back into your earlier, aha moments where you were seeing these problems in society and how you thought that, we needed to think differently about movement and dysfunctions of movement?
Sure. Well, I just went to school like so many of us do. I tended to be drawn towards the mechanical sciences. Naturally, geometry was it's just a skill set of mine that I just happened to be drawn to. But personally, I was always very sedentary until I was about 18. And so I think that maybe the emergence of me going from a very sedentary, bookwormy person, while simultaneously studying physics and geometry and loads through mathematics, I think that it might have been just a perfect storm to have those two things come about. The fact that I was discovering just how good movement made me feel. And I was just studying, really, I was going down a math or physical science path, but I just happened to find in our college catalog this program called, because I didn't know, like so many people, I'm like, what am I going to do with my life? I'm not sure. And I found a program called Biomechanics, and the program had actually already been discontinued from the university. Like biomechanics has fallen off of many universities' books. We can probably talk later on. Like the idea of movement is just becoming. We're such a sedentary culture. It's even falling out of the sciences. Even the fact that someone would pursue knowledge in the area of movement. So I was the last person. Luckily, they have to honor if you were in college during a year or entered it when that degree was offered in a catalog, they still have to honor it for you. So I went on knocking on the door. I'm like, I want to do this thing that you are going to discontinue. And they're like, all right, last one in, then we'll shut the door behind you. And because I had studied so much math and physics, I had already that done. What I didn't have was the physiology and the biology. So I spent really the next 2 years making up in those classes. But at the same time, biomechanics is an option in the science of kinesiology, which is the study of human movement. And there's different branches of specialty. There's exercise physiology, biomechanics, athletic training, which a lot of people going on to physical therapy will do. And even sports psychology, and then pedagogy, which is people who end up bringing movement education to schools. So there's quite a breadth they're really different sciences, but they're all under the umbrella of kinesiology. So I graduated with that as I was, again, just really ramping up my interest of moving my own body. And then I became a personal trainer as just a trade certificate to pay for going to school. And I really loved teaching. I've always been sort of a performer by nature, and like to make people laugh and enjoy themselves, like a comedian sort of. So I was marrying movement and teaching movement in that way. And then, after I graduated, I went and worked with bodies just in a physical fitness setting. I had time in the lab at the university where I got to work with really all sorts of different groups, different bodies. There was gerontology, and there was adaptive physical education where you're working with people who are disabled. You were working with children. You were working with people trying to get fit out in their work time before they went home, like in a very narrow window. And what can I do in only 30 minutes a day? So I just got a real good view of the menu of people who are using movement. And then when I went to graduate school, though, I was very interested in a cross-cultural perspective. So So I didn't get very much cross-cultural perspective in undergraduate. It was pretty much, there's 3 types of movement, and that's fitness, dance, and sports, like, period. That's the statement of, like, those are the only types of movement. But I was really interested in this idea of alignment, I guess, coming up and to figure out, like, where do mechanical diseases come from? Like, I think in terms of loads, just perhaps maybe intuitively, and then certainly cultivated through my education. I just think in terms of pushes and pulls and cause and effect, and what causes our body to be manifesting the physiological processes. They're always explained in chemistry. They're always explained as a biochemical cause, and thus the biochemical effect. But I was really drawn in graduate school. I focused on female pelvic floor disorder and also low back pain during pregnancy, which were very pronounced. And I thought, this just seems odd to me from an evolutionary perspective. That's something everyone has to do and really survive doing and do well would be so problematic. And that's where I really became interested in a cross-cultural perspective of going, okay, well, what do other bodies who have different movement habits, what are other countries, other types of civilizations, like, what do these physiological processes, these biological processes that we all depend on and have to pass through, do they all look like my American education science textbooks, what they say they look like, or they look different? And once I had that door open, it sort of led me to where I am today.
Yeah, it makes total sense. And it's interesting also that you came from it from an academic sense, where you were, looking at your own life and then seeing all this theory around movement in physics and so forth. And so it's a funny way to kind of see how you've combined all these issues. But I actually noticed the same thing when you were talking about that these kind of degrees and these kind of areas of study were being removed from the education system when I was, looking at tertiary courses, because these are the kind of things I was interested in too. I was a sports background, and I was thinking about physiotherapy and these kind of movement applied sciences, but I didn't find something that really stoked my interest in that sense. And I remember a similar degree, but it was very kind of niche. So it's interesting, and that trend has certainly been stripped out of other specialties too. In dentistry, for example, the idea of the movement of the teeth in the jaw and the occlusion and how it fits into craniofacial system is really lacked in terms of besides seeing a static picture. So it's interesting, when you think about that, we really have moved from not only being a sedentary culture, but also we're educating ourselves to think that nothing moves as well. It's a crazy idea when you think about it.
Well, and I'm interested in those two, how those phenomenon are related, because it's like, as you stop moving, your interest, as the phenomenon goes away, if science is really the curiosity that we have about the phenomenon, as it goes away from our everyday lives and something that we can observe, how could you possibly know anything about it? So I think that there's a reason lockstep where we are seeing movement fall out of other pillars of our culture as it falls out of our body, and then we'll see where we get to with that. Good luck.
Yeah, I don't think we get very far with that.
No.
I think we're learning that we really have to think about, how we move as a biological unit. Yeah, it makes total sense, and your book really does help us to kind of bring this back into our life. I wanted to dive back into, because there I think there is a lot of movement dysfunction, and we see it a lot in the jaws. But
Sure.
The connection that, when we work with body workers and, we're trying to get the whole picture into the body, it's a difficult thing to do. But a big connection we see is to the hips and obviously the pelvic floor, in postnatal periods. And so the way this, the women are affected, it really is something that they don't receive a lot of support for. So can you help us kind of just understand what kind of dysfunction you were seeing, and how this relates to a movement-based problem that is, with modern pregnancy?
Oh, sure. I mean, I could talk for so long on that topic. I was trying to think, like, I can't even really remember why I was drawn to the pelvic floor. I do remember that my first graduate research, like big paper with presentation, was on like what are the mechanics, if you had to draw a free body diagram or a mechanical explanation of a baby moving through and coming out of a body, like there's a lot of physical forces at play. What is actually happening? I was really interested in that. And it seemed, as you had said, like sort of niche or obscure, but not really, because everyone else was studying sports and they're like, okay, we're going to, figure out what's happening during a baseball, or a baseball swing or pitch or a golf swing through. And I thought that human delivery was actually the opposite. It was the most generalizable, applicable sense like that you could have for biomechanical understanding of something. And so I learned a lot about the sacrum in that bit of research. So I would say that my pelvic floor interest had a lot to do with just discovering through reading that the sacrum moved in a particular way, which was relative to the pelvis, instead of sort of how we learn where the sacrum is always going everywhere the pelvis goes because it's contained within, which is sort of akin to saying the jaw goes everywhere the head goes because of their orientation. So the connection systems they remind me of each other, I would say. But as far as the sacrum goes, if you're asking, well, what moves the sacrum? If I want to figure out what moves my lower arm relative to my upper arm, pretty easy to figure out through looking at an anatomy and understanding the direction that muscle works and having basic levered sense. So with the sacrum, it being moved on one side by your gluteal muscles and on the other side by the pelvic floor muscles, I was like, it seems to me, because again, one of my other loves of knowing more about was low back pain and sacral pain, and specifically in pregnancy, pubic symphysis pain and sacroiliac joint pain. So I was like, okay, well, before we try to even figure out, in my case, or a physiotherapist case, what correctives we would do, you have to know how something works first. If not, you're just like throwing darts at a wall. Like you're not, there's no bullseye to hit. You have to sort of have a sense of what you're looking for. So that's where my interest really came, was looking at the relationship between like the agonist and antagonist action of the pelvic floor on one side and the glutes on the other side. And then instead of just what exercises should we do to correct this, which is, within the scope of what we do when we're creating, mechanical correction problems or mechanical solutions to problems, would be like, well, what I'm interested in natural movement, or again, that cross-cultural perspective, to be like, well, what movements would maintain this relationship naturally? Like before we go to exercises, which are sort of the unnatural thing that we add back in, why is this a problem now? Why is it such a prevalent problem now? And that's where it came to be, is like the musculoskeletal, let's just say, support of the entire pelvic girdle, to me, I see as beyond the pelvic floor. I see it as the muscles of the hips, the muscles of the abdomen, the muscles of the back. Like all of these things have something to do that allows the pelvis to more or less be stable as it bears the weight of the body, as it bears the weight of additional pregnancy weight, and like you've got a lot of added mass that comes on in that situation, while still allowing for, let's say theoretically, because it's not our condition anymore, but it is still for other people on the planet, that you move robustly during this time. It's not only that, like in hunter, like foraging cultures, you don't take 9 months off when you're pregnant. You don't take 4 months. Like you're still foraging and producing. You're still doing abundant, complex movements. So the idea that your pelvis would become separated or rotate opposite to each other, putting everyone at risk, didn't make any sense to me again. So just to look at what are the levers supposed to be doing, and what resting tensions will we want in the muscles to optimize the role of the levers. And then later on, for that sacral mobility, so important to the delivery, how do we deal with immobile sacrums in this particular culture?
Such an important area, and an immobile sacrum might be kind of go over some listeners' head, because it's such a complex anatomical area. What is the what are the common symptoms of pelvic floor dysfunction in a postnatal period, or in general, or what are the warning signs before, and then what do people generally experience? You mentioned lower back pain. Are there any other kind of presentations that you see commonly?
Well, yeah, and I think that one of the challenges is there's so many different ways that weakness, this general weakness in that whole area can manifest, because again, it's general weakness, but we all have different sizes and shapes. And so what we bring sort of genetically to the game is our anthropometric dimensions. Some people have really long legs, and some people have long torsos and short torsos. So if you have, like, for an example of why the relative position matters, if you have a very long torso and you have weakness in the lower abdomen that can be related to how your pelvic girdle is overall, your long spine needs more support than a short spine. So that same weakness wouldn't be as much of a problem in someone who had a short torso compared to someone who had a long torso. Doesn't mean that they both don't have it. If you're very tall and you have this tendency to, I'm pushing my hips forward right now as we're talking. If you push your hips forward, you're pulling that pubic symphysis apart slightly. If you're shorter and you push your pubic bone forward, it's not as much tension being created as if someone was quite tall and was able to move quite far forward. So just with that in mind, some things that people necessarily wouldn't even think of as pelvic weakness or pelvic girdle weakness could be pubic symphysis pain. It could be sacroiliac joint pain. It could even show up in the lumbar spine, deep hip pain. And I even put hernias, inguinal hernias and abdominal hernias into that same core, lower core. The forces aren't balanced in that area. That could be a sign that's not necessarily painful per se, but it is a sign that something is moving in a direction that it's not supposed to be moving for sustainability purposes of your body. I mean, of course, the classics are incontinence, where you have a difficult time holding your bladder, but it can also be sometimes, and I think maybe counterintuitively, too much tension. So a lot of people deal with hypertonic pelvic floor disorder. Sometimes just the hypertonicity of the pelvic floor interfering with your sexual relationship, or, birthing, or just even how difficult it feels. Like, even if there's no pain, there's like a discomfort. Like, those are all, I would put them in my way of organizing, all under pelvic girdle issues that can arise when that muscular balance is not right.
Such a fundamental area that can affect so many parts of our, for months to years, after delivering. And it really kind of speaks to this theme of, a lack of, appreciation, understanding of how movement is important, even through pregnancy, where, you really think, okay, maybe we should be, resting more. But, when we look through what traditional societies did, there's this movement culture that keeps us kind of in this, biomechanical system that does have to birth a child as well.
Yeah.
There's a little bridge there that I think we can probably make that starts to go into your book, is that, these dysfunctions, do you see them contributing through birthing problems with the mechanical aspects of birth? And are children suffering because, mothers, don't have this kind of, they're not tapped into this system as they should be? Is the birthing process, is that affecting the initial stages of our babies?
Right. Well, I mean, perhaps directly. I don't think that we've ever, I don't think even that thing that's on anyone's radar to even take a look at. But I think indirectly, these are the things. So I was really writing about what I wanted to write about in a lot of my earlier work on pelvic floor stuff, would be so that people could optimize themselves beforehand, right? Like that would be the goal. And there's plenty of people who sign up for prenatal fitness. It's just that people usually approach prenatal fitness in the idea of maintaining your physical fitness and your weight through pregnancy, which is different than a perspective of doing movements to optimize the actual delivery process. And then, of course, the best program would do both. And so that is the program that we all were bequeathed, essentially the one that kept us physically fit and also made delivery happen with fewer problems, right? The idea that it would be a smooth process. A lot of the issues, so my intention was to create it so people do it before, but many people have found me and my writing after their first delivery that didn't go in the way that they wanted it to go, and are looking for to try to understand. I had so many expectations or beliefs about how this was, because we talk so much about, pregnancy is a natural thing. Of course, you're just going to do it, instead of saying absolutely, and ... the way we treat our bodies right now physically is interfering with this otherwise natural biological process that's about to happen. So to realize that there's something that you can do to prepare, but when you're on the other side, and if you have to have, whether you have surgical intervention like a cesarean, or you have vaginal delivery and you need to have stitches afterwards because something tore, to the person who had pain in the pelvis and the low back before, during pregnancy, where it tends to show up on the other side is, now I have this weight, this 8-pound, 7-pound, 10-pound thing that I have to deal with, carry it, pick it up, bend over, twist. And I couldn't even do those things before I had something in my arms. So I think that a lot of people, we'll talk about Grow Wild in a little bit, but a lot of the recommendations are about you carrying your children, how beneficial, how part of their physical robusticity is developed by you moving with them. But if you can't move with them because you couldn't move beforehand due to some muscle imbalances, then it does start to affect, right, the development of the child, but it's sort of downstream. You wouldn't necessarily see it like you need to pass through the vaginal canal in order to have your bones squish in a particular way. That's a direct line of going, I can see how I move my body moves things down this way. But I'm really talking about the indirect things that we don't think about, which is, especially for a lot of people, I can't stand and hold my baby, so I'm going to have to put it in something and wheel it through. And we have tons of solutions that we come up with to get, I'm a parent, you come up with all sorts of things that you can do to get parenting done. But there's this huge hole in our understanding about the importance of not only moving enough to be fit, but moving all of our parts well, so that our forces are balanced and pulling on our skeleton and our joints in a way that ekes out of them the structure that continues to support the biological things that we want to do, right? Which is breathing, going to the bathroom, eating, birthing, these are biological, sleeping. And we don't really see movement as directly related to those, but they are all intertwined deeply with how we move. And it's just time to be making that information widely available.
I couldn't agree more, and I can attest to this. It's funny, every single point you said, I was thinking about a time. I've got 3 kids under 3, or my oldest is 3, and that the physical carrying my son is a challenge. And I remember when he was about 18 months, I was having the kind of one-sided shoulder pain, the numbness down the right arm, which was a cross between a problem between my clinical posture and doing this extra job, which is parenting, which is all the time when you get home, right? And my body was not happy. And I had to realize that I had to change my movement. I was more of a kind of heavier trainer before that. I had to completely relax all that stuff and focus on flexibility. In particular, my hips. I had to release and understand how my hip posture and everything related to the lower back, the legs, and then the shoulders too. And then eventually I was able to fix my posture and then change my body so that I could carry my kids. So it's crazy that, all of those things, have really come out through the painful journey we've had as parents. But I couldn't agree more that people need to find this earlier, and this idea that, you know, if we can get this message out, that if this is on people's mind and if we can start to change the culture, then these problems, you know, for pregnant women and then subsequently their children are going to be, you know, markedly less. So it's such a great theme that kind of runs through and into your book, where, you know, you've gone through observing these adult problems and then seeing it into children. So let's start to talk about children. So what kind of, just to start with, what kind of symptoms and issues are you immediately spotting in kids that are grown up in this sedentary environment? Like, what are they suffering from that the parents should be looking at to start with, that their kids probably aren't moving properly or enough?
Yeah. And so as far as symptoms goes, everything that I'm going to see is going to be movement related, which isn't to say that a lot of these seemingly non-movement things are also not movement related, but those are the ones that I can speak to. So just in general, there's just it seems to be a decline in the robusticity with which children move. I mean, one thing is just simply like, you can go to a playground space and just see kids moving differently than maybe how they moved 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. You know, kids, there's a lot of activity and moving around, but it's just sort of become more still. All my kids went through a nature program. They got to go through a nature preschool program. And there was a decline in, I would say, balance, you know, just like general balance. You know, I always see kids, and myself, I was being a kid at one point, just like walking on fences, doing sort of risky things. You know, you'd see kids climb up on something and just sort of push themselves to things that maybe looked risky. And now I see kids just like falling off low logs, like low Y logs. And a lot of it has to do with, I think, it's you know, I talk about it in the book, just like what the footwear or the things that kids are being put in. Everything's getting thicker and harder for the body to communicate with the outside of the body world. You know, I can't really perceive what's coming from the ground because they can't feel it. Attention wise or hyperactivity, like, I don't really like to use those terms, but I know that there's increase in like hyperactivity or attention deficit, but there's so much research of really just recognizing how that relates to the amount of movement someone has had to do before they can sit down and focus on a task. You know, like we would walk to school or run around, and then we would sit, we would have recess before school, and then we would sit down. Well, as we've gotten rid of any physical activity, riding your bike or walking to school, and as recesses times, I'm not sure if it is the same in Australia, but here they're just declining. Like you're losing middle school and later elementary school recess, where you just come, you wake up, you get in your car, you drive to your car, and you sit down in class, and you'll get to move in a few hours. So of course, these little machines that are meant to sense and read the world, understand the world physically, are sort of rebelling in their own particular way, which is why movement is so helpful. So like, there's just like the physical performance. There's been a decline in, there's a test that we give, I don't give it, but that usually occupational therapists will give, or physical therapists in the school setting, like a kindergarten readiness test. And it's measuring fine motor skills of grasping and just like how well they're moving on some standardized set of tests. And the test scores are just going down. Fewer kids are able to pass sort of this physical fitness. I mean, it's not even physical fitness. Like I said, it's just how well can you control the movements of your body to do things like draw a circle or things that will be called on. And as we've lost whole body movement, there seems to be this loss in fine motor movement, despite the fact that we've sort of given kids pads and fine motor buttons. It doesn't seem to work the other way around. Whole body stuff gets you better fine motor, but more fine motor sedentary time does not flow up to better whole body or controlled movement. So again, it's just why kids need to have, I mean, it's so much more than we could probably even fathom. Like we're like, okay, we need to make sure our kids get in that 1 hour exercise class when they're really meant to be incapable of moving really all day long, much more than adults. I mean, we could do that too, but they just seem to have this incessant need for physical exploration, exploring their environment through their physicality.
Yeah, I love that description, that they're little machines and they're literally kind of tweaking and sensing the world and then adjusting as, in response to, which is, it kind of leads into your definition of movement as a nutrient, which I really like too, because it helps us think that this input that we've taken away has a biological effect. And we know, so for instance, chewing as a really kind of basic example, we know now that there's an effect on the development of the jaw, the maxilla and mandible. The jawbones don't develop as well, and that we see this in anthropological trends as we take away the harder kind of fibrous and bony foods of ripping and tearing of meats, that our jaws stop developing. And this is a literal nutrient that our children need. To describe movement as a nutrient, you also kind of break it down into micronutrients, which you started to talk about, and macronutrients too. Can you help us think about how to define movement as a nutrient, and how this breaks down into different categories of physicality?
Yeah, so in one hand, it seems like an analogy, like where I'm just trying to say movement works like nutrition works, and it does. But I would also argue that movement is a nutrient in exactly the same way vitamin D from sunlight is, and chemical compound for food is. What you're doing is with those biochemical inputs, you're putting them into your body, and once they enter your body, they interact with your cells in a very predictable way for each separate nutrient, and they affect the behavior of those cells like that. And it is because in the absence of one of those physical compounds, there are predictable symptoms that arise. That is why they are classified as nutrients. So like you have to think about, like, you have to get a little Socratic about it. So Socrates, you could be like, what makes something a nutrient? If you've never asked yourself that question because someone just gave you the list of nutrients, that's what makes them nutrients. If you don't get these things that have been deemed nutrients, there are very predictable symptoms and ailments that arise that when you reintroduce the nutrient, they dissipate or go away. So that's how it got that classification. We already know that same phenomenon works with movement. So the one difference is, well, I guess not. We have sunlight. So sunlight isn't something that you ingest. It's something that you interact with. And you're interacting with movement too on the cellular level. So when you move, you're moving, you could think about movement as a whole body phenomenon, which it is, but it is also your individual parts moving that move their individual parts. So like we're getting down to like arms and legs, and then we're getting down to the cells that make up the muscles, and then the nerve cells and the bone cells. So on the cellular level, any movement that you do with your body bends or twists or pulls on those cells. Once you have that physical deformation of a cell, the cell responds by creating biochemistry that then goes on to affect the way that cell behaves. So it's like the cell creates the biochemistry that you're ingesting, but movement is the precursor. And then it goes on and flows the same way as sunlight or food. So with that understanding of like, oh, I'm putting movement into my body. So like you are putting movement into your body. It doesn't go in through your mouth. It's more like sunlight. It comes in, not on your skin, but it comes in through the cells by the way the cells deform. There's got to be some way that we can break down, like, because we know that you need whole body movement, but we also know enough to know that different tissues need different types of movements, like even tissue types, like bone has a certain requirement for movement. You can move abundantly in water. Let's just say some thought experiment. You were born and you moved entirely through water. And so you are extremely active. You got whatever the swimming equivalent is of 10,000 steps a day or 5 miles a day. Your bones would atrophy because swimming, while still meeting the needs for certain movements, don't meet bones' need for movement. The eyes would change. And we even see this phenomenon, and there's different cultures that spend quite a significant amount of time free diving for food, and their children's eyes change shape and see differently than eyes of people who spend more time above water. So there's lots of examples of, we're quite malleable. That's why humans have been so successful and prolific, is because our tissue is just quite malleable. It really can adapt to the environment in which it spends a lot of time in. And so once we know that, okay, well, not all tissues need the same thing. Well, now we're sort of at the macronutrient part of the explanation, which is, we know that it's not only that you eat enough calories. It's like, okay, well, we know now that you could have all fat, only fat, and have abundant calories, and you would still have diseases that are reduced when you add in protein. Or you could eat all protein, but if you don't have fat or a certain amount of carbohydrate, you'll have predictable diseases. And that's how this understanding of a balance or a ratio set came about. And so the movement is the same. So we need different types of movement. And let's just say that we've been already working with a macronutrient framework, but we would call it, you need a certain amount of cardio, you need a certain amount of strength training, and you need a certain amount of flexibility. That would be a healthy diet, movement diet. But then micronutrients were like the next level of understanding. It's like, whoa, you can even have your macronutrient profiles balanced, but if none of it contained vitamin K, you're gonna have some problems. Okay, so like then you identify these smaller pieces. So micronutrients in the analogy of movement, or really the phenomenon of movement, would be your individual parts. So you have a lot of individual parts. One of the every hinge that you have needs to be moved as part of how it's fed. How it draws nutrients to it, these individual parts, is through their unique movements. And so we can be very physically fit. We could even be meeting our appropriate cardio, strength training, and flexibility, but there can be an area in our body that doesn't move at all. And so therefore we're missing a micronutrient of maybe the pelvic floor, right? Like the pelvic floor in an otherwise fit and mobile person who made sure they cross-trained and, had upper back day and lower body day, to use some bodybuilding ways of hitting it, could still be sedentary in their pelvic floor. So they would be undernourished or malnourished in that area, and there's going to be predictable symptoms that arise when you have areas like sedentary cells. Like I call it cellular sedentarism in a couple of papers that I wrote, to understand that whole body fitness is but a small part of what we're talking about with movement. There are many people who are physically fit who are still dealing with movement malnourishment, but it has less to do with starvation and more to do with missing micronutrients, where someone else might be starved of actual movement calories. And so that's why the food analogy is to recognize that everyone falls on a continuum somewhere, and everyone needs to work on their movement diet. For some people, it's dialing in the micronutrients. For others, it's just starting to eat.
It's funny, we say it's an analogy, but you really do see the real world, the translation to the physiology, like vitamin D. So it moves into, for instance, the skeletal system. We know that the bones will remodel in response to movement. So it really does kind of fit right into the category of movement being a nutrient, which is great. I think it really simplifies for people to understand, how we need to integrate this into our everyday life, like we do for food. There's a question here that fits into this. Claudia asks, movement is good and necessary, but are some types of movement, even sports, that are not good? Can you have too much of a certain nutrient, for instance?
Sure. And we know that that's what I spent time trying to lay out and move your DNA, which is nutrients aren't good or bad. They're just a nutrient. And that nutrients really work in relationship with one another. So I picked what, could be arguably one of the healthiest foods in that book was kale. And to say, kale is a good nutrient, but if you only eat kale, you're going to be sick. And so it's this to recognize that whenever you're talking about diet, you're always talking about a ratio or a relationship of nutrients that you're consuming, and the same goes for movement. You are looking at what does your total movement diet look like? Because the answer to Claudia's question has more to do with Claudia's movement diet. The question is, what types of movement or even sports might not be great for me, given what your goals are, the current state of your body. So I have a form called it's an activity tracker on my website to help answer that question, because you're going to have to assess how you move throughout the day to figure out, like a lot of people, let me go back a little bit. If you sit all day at work and your sport or your favorite activity puts you in a position that still has you sitting, like say you get out of your chair to go sit on a bicycle, that period of time on a bicycle can improve your physical fitness. It can get your heart rate up, it can move your lungs. But as far as how it moves your musculoskeletal system, it's still leaving large portions of you sedentary. And then when you combine, like let's say you exercised every day, but you also worked every day, now your movement diet looks more like being in a flexed hip, slightly flexed spine position all hours of the day. So I'm going to say in that situation, you're going to want to get rid of, well, first of all, if you can decrease your flexed hip, flexed spine position at work, that would be one way of moving more at work. But you also want to see if your sport is moving you in a different way than the rest of a large portion of your life. And so you have to really look at all of the different parts of the body that need movement for you to be able to figure out if the sport of your choice is the nutrients that you need or not. Like that's the clearest I can answer this question, because I think in the end, anything that moves you is great and valuable, or provides some sort of joy or thrill or other things that we are free to seek in our life. But when you're talking about mechanically, the question is what are the holes in your movement diet and what are the symptoms that you're currently dealing with? And then that's how you decide.
Makes total sense. And then, there might be medical kind of conditions or something that,
sure.
That exactly. So it really is an individual, assessment. But it makes total sense that you balance it from, the perspective of what you're doing all the time. And then, how can you counteract that, which is a real kind of movement analogy. Getting into, what you wrote about in Grow Wild, which is, such a great practical tool for parents to really kind of integrate this into their kids' lives. One thing that I mentioned previously that we see in the dental practice a lot is this lack of chewing and the effect on the jaw. And so how teeth are crooked now because of the lack of chewing, for one aspect, but then the function of the tongue and breathing that flows on. How do you see this, kind of dietary input in this lack of mechanical chewing as a nutrient? And, how can parents start to think about this as a way to get kids chewing more? Because it is a difficult issue, because we see kids with these underdeveloped jaws and they are a little bit adverse to chewing.
Sure.
So how do you approach this and go about helping kids to start moving their craniofacial system better?
Well, I mean, there's just what I chose to do with my own kids, which is easy because I started it from the beginning. So there's definitely a relationship too between the strength in the jaw to chew, the ability to handle textures, of different foods, and then eventually the ability to tolerate a wide range of tastes. So it's like we don't only have a what do we call it, like a soft food problem or a lack of food. Like our food's bland across the board. It's a one-note song. It's the same. You know what I mean? Like it's like so bland in every way that you look at it. It's just soft, flavorless, or one flavor. Like it just tends to be like all sweet or all bread. Like just one thing. And then if it's not that, the kid's like, I can't eat it. And it's not only that they can't tolerate maybe the taste or the texture. At some point, they don't have the strength to be able to deal with it. And all those things are interconnected. So just to remind yourself, that these aren't discrete. They're discrete phenomenon in the sense that they're all separate issues and can be analyzed separately, but they all stem from the same thing, what you grew up eating, and that you become adapted structurally to what you're choosing to put in to your body, food, texture, firmness included. So for us, like, we always wanted to make sure, and we still do this now. My kids are 9 and 10 now. Like, I was just thinking, their lunchbox always has at least 2 or 3 hard things to chew, things that I don't cut down, things that require them to masticate, because there's also a relationship now between mastication and blood flow to the brain, right? Chewing does more than food, but chewing does more than also just setting up these tissues. There's a role that chewing has in how our physiology functions on even the nervous system level. So I always want to make sure that there's like a big old carrot, an apple in there. And then of course, like ripping and tearing, I think, is also a big thing. So jerkies, whether it's meat or fruit, like mangoes are really good and hard to rip. Like, I want them to be able to yank on those. And I know the sentiment for a long time was like, don't use your teeth for anything hard because they'll all fall out. But I think it's, like, don't use your teeth as a tool was the story when I was a kid. But I really think that there's a value in seeing your teeth as a tool for eating, and that you can like break things off, that aren't extremely hard or damaging, but they need to be used regularly. And then the last thing that we use were actual chewing sticks. So I don't know if you have them there, but we have chewing sticks here, and chewing sticks are things that a lot of other cultures spend a lot of time just masticating. They're usually just branches of wood, and there's the benefit to the mastication, but there's also a benefit to what's in the wood is particularly cleansing, whether it's antiseptic naturally or antibacterial, antimicrobial. Like, there's a list of woods that different cultures have used, but now they sell just chewing sticks that are treated with tea tree oil or cinnamon oil. And we always made that sort of a treat, like if you're driving or if we're hiking, like this idea that you can take out this stick and sort of just work your jaw without necessarily consuming a calorie really opened up this idea of chewing as an exercise. And I just saw, like, on YouTube video, a new chewing exercise, plastic, put in your mouth and exercise your jaw thing. So like, we're at the point now where it's like the treadmill for walking. Nobody was walking. So we're going to put basically a revolving platform right where you're at so that you can get on it and move. It's like the chewing treadmill. Just put it in your mouth and go nowhere, but just, chew it. So that we've just always made chewing a micronutrient. Like, we've always made sure that it was something that was being done every day, not obnoxiously through do this exercise, not obnoxiously, but kids don't like to have to do stuff. So I just chose food that did the exercise for them. So I didn't have to have them do a therapeutic exercise on top of their daily living. I just set the daily living up to move them.
It makes total sense. And in your book, you kind of define it as snacktivities, which I really like, to think about how, activities and cooking goes together. And because another thing that you say is that, cooking and movement movement and eating are entwined. That's sure. How, eating comes about in human culture. So it's funny how we've disconnected it in this way. We've got, somewhat of a negative connotation with eating, that, you're kind of sedentary when you do it. It's a bad thing because you're sitting there and eating, but actually, movement leads to, this activity of eating, which should all kind of intertwine together. I really like that as a way of kind of changing our perspective on meals and so forth, and how to integrate that into kids' lives. Now, there's lots of practical activities and tips in your book. One that I really liked is the idea of nutrient-dense movements, and one of the big changing, eye-opening aspects that I've been focusing on is the tongue and the complexity of the tongue and the model of the brain's homunculus to map the muscles of the tongue. But equally, in terms of how detailed the brain's homunculus is in the digits and the fingers. And you talk about how it's really important to get these nutrient-dense movements in the fingers of a child, which I really think is important. And there's some great kind of activities that you recommend parents get their child doing to help their fingers and their digits start to move, to stimulate this area of the brain.
Well, and that was, you had asked me earlier about one of the signs. Where kids are losing grip strength. Young adults are losing grip strength, meaning like this is a group of people that is less capable physically with their hands than the generation before them. So the hypothesis is that like we've gone from laboring, physically, tending our own gardens or even doing our own housework. And like now there's just devices, you can get a Roomba and it's like going around on your floor and sweeping up so that you don't have to hold a tool and sweep up or do anything. So grip strength is declining, and that doesn't seem to be such a big deal because it's like, well, if you don't have to use your arms, so be it. We're in a culture that doesn't. But the problem is that grip strength relates to all-time mortality. Low grip strength does. So the thing is, it might seem like it can just go because we've set up our culture not to need it, but it seems like it has a more important function than just cleaning up or doing our labor, that it's built into our anatomy to maintain it or to be preventive in some way. And so like that's the challenge, is as we quickly move to convenience and celebrate the loss of movement as a human benefit or a sign of progress, we're not very clear on the role these movements have in maintaining our physiology or preventing other diseases from settling in. And I think that there's quite a bit of evidence that, movement is the most preventive or protective thing people can do for their health. So the idea that convenience is superior because it saves us time is it's very challengeable. It'd be a very narrow perspective, maybe only an economic perspective or a time is money perspective, where losing the movement would actually be beneficial to the humans or the human race. Getting, knife skills, like as scary as it sounds, you've got 3 under 3, but again, around the world, being able to be physically capable with everyday tools is something that other cultures really instill in their children right away. They need capable children. They need children who can contribute and learn what it will take to be an adult. And you want to on-ramp pretty quickly. You don't want humans already have the longest on-ramp. We don't need a longer on-ramp. So we don't want to stretch our already long on-ramp and sort of dilute those first 5 years when they could be quickly on-ramping to some of the skills. So, one of the easiest things you can do for your hand strength is just climb a tree or hang from a branch or hang from a bar. Like get kids used to hanging from their own hands. I've heard so many parents worry. It's I think that they're going to dislocate their arms if they, they have a lot of worries about it. And I'm trying to say brachiation is a very natural, age-old human movement, and we want to be able to do it. You can definitely on-ramp a little bit more slowly if you're concerned about that. I outline that in the book. But so many kids here, and again, I don't know if it was an international phenomenon, but there's these little pieces of plastic and metal toys that were just to fidget spin, to just sit there and move your hand for nothing, just for the pleasure of the sensation. And the pleasure and the sensation of movement is definitely something that has value, but it also used to have a purpose, and it actually still has a purpose. We're just not teaching our kids how to really dig in and be physically capable or capable in nature, like to be able to pick things up, to be able to knit, have those fine motor skills, to be able to grasp and weave. These are all things that can keep your hands busy, that really teach your dexterity that we're seeing wane. And it's decreasing again, because not only because our whole bodies aren't moving, it's probably because of what they're doing when they're not moving. They're just our bodies tend to be just sitting inside and just maybe taking in something on a screen or something that does not require a lot of physical interaction. So definitely cooking, start cooking more from scratch. Let the kids stir, let the kids knead, let the kids chop, give them something to do that not only gives them that sensation with their hands, but gives them a purpose, and then also learning, right? Something that they're going to need to know as an adult.
Yeah, I have to share a story about my kids. My son's very conservative, and one of the most conservative kids. He's very cautious, and we make eggs in the morning. And so with him, he'd get up and kind of tap the egg very slightly, and then slowly crack it open. He'd wait for me to do it. But my daughter is the exact opposite. She's hanging off things. She's running. She's very. You can see she's a very resilient. Always wants to challenge herself. And so she smashes the egg, and then it just goes everywhere. It's a completely different set of circumstances. Yeah. But you can see how they're processing and thinking about, cracking the egg and then getting it into the bowl. It's a different outcome, but it's the way they process it themselves. It's fascinating to watch. One of the things we've talked about the jaw, the hands, the hips, but one thing you suggest in your book is to think about kids' feet, and that how being barefoot is like a nutrient too, and that how kids need to feel the earth. I really like this idea. How can parents think about, because we live in a society where we wear shoes, what are some of the considerations for kids, especially to help them get this proprioceptive input through the feet?
Well, we all wear shoes, but we just don't need to wear them probably as much as we are wearing them. I mean, sometimes people will put shoes and socks on infant feet, feet that are just sitting around while the baby's laying on their back are wrapped in shoes and socks. Well, their feet right now are just equal to their hands. They're reaching, they're trying to push, they're trying to grasp. They're getting a lot of information from their environment. I think of the feet as ears. And so you wouldn't put gloves on your baby's hands or earmuffs, right? Because it's going to dampen the information that's supposed to be. When I talk about stimulation of them, what I mean is it's stimulating their anatomical and physiological development. It's not only, we don't come with blueprints that are going to show where our physical bodies are going to end up. So much of where our physical bodies end up are based on the inputs that we had access to. Nutrition, dietary nutrition is certainly one of them. Safety is another one, but so is movement. Movement is probably the biggest one because it's the most constant of the environments. So look for places where you're dampening that foot, the foot sounds, what your feet are getting from the environment unnecessarily. So that's when you're in the house, certainly when you're in any place that someone, I'm still talking about young babies, that aren't really doing a lot of outside or cold weather walking. And then make sure you go to places where, safety is, I think, for parents, they're worried, right? They're like, oh, my kids are going to step on something, or they're going to pick up something. So if you have a yard, clean your yard, create a space where your child can go outside safely, or find a park or a beach area. Just physically comb it with your eyes if you're really concerned about it, and then be like, yes, they need this time. It's detrimental for them not to get this time. If you're worried about safety, just know that part of them developing well and able to deal with physical situations is to have that robusticity that takes time and interaction to develop. We're not going to get really good at risk management if you remove all risk. Where my barefoot children who had the opportunity to step on stinging nettle, or to step on rose thud, anything sticky or poking on the ground, what do they get? These are not significant or even really truly injuries. They're awareness. They're how we learn how to be better at being outside. Certainly I don't want them stepping on a hypodermic needle that's laying on the ground, and that's a possibility. But because my children are aware that there are things in the ground that they can be hurt by, their awareness is it's superb. It's better than mine. The risk is all on them. Whereas if you have a kid that's only in shoes, and then they go into being barefoot suddenly without that period of time of adaptation, they're much more likely to stumble or fall. They're not paying attention to how they're walking because they're so covered in safety materials. They don't have to ever learn those lessons. So it's just, you're always, a parent is always balancing between how can they learn this lesson in a way that won't do great harm. And when you get so concerned with the great harm that you lose the lesson, at that point, you're too far to one side. So you're just sort of always negotiating usually your own comfort level. So my recommendation for parents is you should probably just go barefoot a little bit more too, so that you understand what it calls for, and then you can be a better leader in that attempt. And then just also buy flexible shoes. You can't be barefoot all the time, but you can certainly buy footwear that doesn't have an inch of stiff plastic where even the movements of the foot are completely disabled right now. Like, you really allow them as much flexibility as possible.
Yeah, in your book you put it as, pool shoes are good because it's that thin material
Sure.
that's kind of flat on the ground. There's so many practical tips, and your last point, really kind of went to my last question as to this book really tells parents how to integrate this and think about all of these things of this environment of intuitive movement. So kids are just doing this and developing in this way that is how their bodies are designed to interact. The theme, though, I feel through your book is resilience, and that resilience is health. And if we help kids to build this resilience, they build the systems themselves to deal with these issues. And I really love that because it just helps. I think we do need more resilience. And, do you feel that that's something that kids and, parents themselves need to kind of, be a little bit more connected to how we get our next generation to be more resilient?
I think so. And I think that, we focus on resilience, but we tend to be thinking about like social emotional resilience. And I think that that's important, but equally important is the physical resilience. Being physically resilient relates to our emotional resilience. One of the best stories I ever heard from somebody was a child. She said that the parent had said that I was not very physically successful child. I was clumsy and had a hard time integrating. I couldn't play. And my daughter is the same way. We both have it. She just inherited this from me. But then she read something and she decided to build, just like I talk about in the book, some indoor monkey bars, like something hanging apparatus, and built it. And she sent me video of the daughter kind of trepidatiously approaching it and not really knowing what to do. And then they just left her alone with it for a week or two. And at that end of that time, because the child had sort of unfettered access, no environmental pressure of anyone else watching her do it or fail or figure it out on her own, right? Your kids are cracking eggs or figuring out how to crack eggs. It's not an easy thing when you think about splitting it. Like, some kids are great with whole body, some kids are better at fine motor, and we're all here to learn how to balance it all out. And then this kid who couldn't go on the playground, this young kid now who had been held back, which felt, it measured to the parents as a social problem. This child has a social issue. Really, once she got over the physical hurdle, it turned out that her confidence was related to her physical capability. And, and once that was rectified, she's back out, and now she views herself as a mover and is able to integrate and be more physically resilient in these physical situations, which is definitely a benefit. I mean, life is a series of physical situations. We've made them all sort of sitting down, but there are quite a lot of outdoor physical robust, like where our bodies need to be able to participate to their full ability, even if you have a disability, to maximize the ability that you have to really be able to ultimately have the experiences that you want. I mean, like, that's what it's all about.
Absolutely. And, it really is, when you think back to your childhood, that's really what you want to give, your children, that ability and, safety, but also the freedom to actually experience things and have these experiences themselves. It really is, I think, such a big part of growth and development. I really enjoyed your book, Grow Wild, and thank you so much for putting it together, because I think it's such an important message for parents to kind of just help to integrate into their thinking of how they help their child to grow better, stronger bodies in the world out there. So thank you very much, Katy. Where can people find you? Where can people get the book? Tell us a little bit more about where we can find out more.
Nutritious Movement is the name of my company, so nutritiousmovement.com, and then on social media at Nutritious Movement. And there's so much free content there. I mean, just weeks worth, months worth of podcasts and articles. There's 8 different books. Even our YouTube channel has things that you can do with your kids. So you can definitely check all that there. Come over and say hi.
Yeah, I highly recommend checking out Katie's social, but also grabbing the book Grow Wild, which is available on Amazon too, right?
Yeah, you can get it anywhere. If you're in bookstores in many countries, for sure there, but Amazon's always, going to get it done.
Katy, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us. I really enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to diving further into the biomechanical importance of moving, and I'm sure your work's going to continue and grow. It's such an exciting space, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about it.
Well, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Katy.
Bye.